over the next lessons, we're going to be talking about how to write both notes and rests in measures. Now, this does get a little bit complicated, so we have a really awesome, unique, nifty color coding system that you'll see in a moment. Using pages from my #1 bestseller book, The Best Music Theory Book for Beginners, that sold over 5,000 copies. My name is Dan Spencer. I'm your music mentor. The full playlist with over 100 music theory lessons is in the video description. I recommend watching them in order. And now, back to the lesson. So first, let's talk about some rest rules. We have 6 rules for rests. Please feel free to come back to this page whenever you are writing music. Rule number 1 is a rest starting on a strong beat can, C-A-N, can, it is able to last into a weak beat. Rule number 2 is a rest starting on a weak beat cannot last into the next beat or beats. Use separate rests. That one's interesting. 3, when possible, combine smaller rests into larger rests as long as this does not break the previous 2 rules. Ooh. If your head's starting to spin, don't worry, we're going to break it down. Number 4, a whole rest shows a measure of silence in all time signatures. You might remember that one. 5, whole rest should be written at the beginning of a measure in 4/4, whereas in 3/4, we're going to write them in the middle of a measure. And that's rule number 6. So let's review our strong and weak beat colors. Strongest beats are green, strong beats are yellow, weak beats are orange, weakest beats are red. And the order of strongest and weakest beats in 4/4 is going to be strongest, weak, strong, weakest, and in 3/4 is strongest, weak, weakest. Now, you're going to start to see how this really matters for writing rests and notes. So, let's look at this. Whole rests. Well, whole notes, sure enough, those can go on strongest beats. Half notes can go on strongest, strong, and weak beats. Very true. Quarter notes can go on all 4 types of beats. A whole rest can only go on a strongest beat unless it's in 3/4, in which case you write it in the middle of the measure. A half rest can only be written on a strongest or a strong beat, and a quarter rest can go on any beat. Let's review this before we move forward. We have 6 rules for rests, and don't worry, we're going to see those rules in application. A rest starting on a strong beat can, it is able to, it is good if a rest starting on a strong beat goes to a weak beat. A rest starting on a weak beat cannot last into the next beats, so it has to only be on that weak beat. If you want the next beat after a weak beat to be silent, you need to use another rest. Whenever possible, you're going to combine smaller rests into larger rests, as long as it doesn't break the previous 2 rules. And that's really, rule number 3 is really for beginners, because you're going to have a moment where you have like 4 quarter rests in a row, and then you're like, wait, hang on, oh, there was rule 3, or combine. Because if you do rule number 1 or rule number 2 perfectly, you will not find yourself with rule number 3. So rule number 3 is just to catch you if you made a mistake in rule number 1 or rule number 2. A whole rest shows a measure of silence in all time signatures. In whole rests, we write them at the beginning of measures in 4/4, and we write them in the middle of measures in 3/4. I will see you in the next lesson. There is one key concept for you to understand before we look at correct and incorrect examples for 4/4 and 3/4 using a combination of notes and rests, and that is the imaginary divide between beats 2 and 3 when we are in 4/4 or common time. This imaginary divide, nothing can cross it. It's like an imaginary barrier that nothing can pass except for 3 things: a whole rest, a whole note, and a half note. The 3 things that can cross this barrier are a whole note, a whole rest, and a half note. So let's see some examples of this in application. So we imagine that there is a divide between beats 2 and 3 right here. Now we have a problem because this half rest starts on beat 2 and lasts into beat 3, right? Because half rests get 2 beats, they get 2 counts. Now right there, that's crossing our imaginary divide. That is wrong. No, sir, cannot do that. Let's look at one more. This is actually almost the same example, but I'll do it again just to make sure you get it. So we have a half rest starting on beat 2. That's wrong for a number of reasons, but this is one of the reasons. Half rest starts on beat 2, lasts into beat 3. There's an imaginary divide between beats 2 and 3. Half rest is not one of the three things that can cross. The three things that can cross are a whole rest, a whole note, or a half note. And a half rest is not one of those. That's wrong. That is not okay. Now let's look at a correct example. Oh, right here we have indeed beat 2 half note lasts into beat 3 because a half note is worth 2 beats or 2 counts, so it's worth all of this. But that's okay because there's 3 things that can cross our imaginary divide between beats 2 and 3, and those are whole notes, whole rests, and half notes. So an easy way to remember which type of rest you can use where is to think to yourself, okay, if I put a half rest on beat 2, because I want 2 beats of consecutive silence, I want beats 2 and 3 to be quiet, so I'm going to put a half rest on beat 2. That's wrong because of that divide between beats 2 and 3, and a half rest cannot cross it. So that's incorrect. I'll see you in the next lesson where we talk even more about the divide between beats 2 and 3 in the time signature of 4/4 or common time. And we also look at some correct and incorrect examples and how they're breaking our 6 rest rules from the previous page and the previous lesson. I'll see you guys there. In this lesson, we're going to be breaking down some correct and incorrect examples using a mix of notes and rests, but mainly we're going to be focusing on the rests to show why they are incorrect in the incorrect examples and why they are right in the correct examples. So all of these measures sound exactly the same. They're just written differently. It's like writing the word to, T-O-O, versus T-O versus T-W-O. They all sound the same, but they're written differently. All right, let's take a look at this first one. Okay, so this is incorrect for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's crossing our imaginary divide between beats 2 and 3, and there's only 3 things that can cross that divide, and that is a whole note, a whole rest, and a half note. So that's no good from that perspective. And then also, rest rule number 2, we cannot start a rest on a weak beat and then have it last into another beat. So anytime you want to have a rest on a weak beat, it's most likely going to be a quarter note because that rest cannot continue on into the next beat. You need to write a second notation, which might be another quarter rest in the case of this, to get the correct. So let's look at the correct example, and sure enough, we got 2 quarter rests, which means number 1, we have our divide between beats 2 and 3, very clean, and number 2, the rest on the weak beat is not lasting into the next beat. Here is our next incorrect example. We have a quarter rest on beat 1, 2, and 3 on the strongest, weak, and strong beats. Okay, so this right here, this example is interesting. So we do have the divide between beats 2 and 3, so that's good. Now, the problem is, this is actually breaking rest rule number 3. And rest rule number 3 is that we need to combine any smaller rests into larger rests whenever possible. And sure enough, because we have this strongest beat here, it's okay, rest rule number 1, it's okay to have rests that last into other beats if they start on strong beats. That's the last for 2. Let's go over, look at the correct one. Sure enough, we have a half rest lasting for 2 beats, and it's okay for the half rest to be there because it's starting on a strong beat, and the half rest is not starting on a weak beat. So another way to think of this is you can look at the color coding too, and the color coding shows these same rules. It's like you can't write a half rest on a weak beat or a weakest beat. You can't do it. Anytime you want a weak beat or a weakest beat to be quiet, there to be silence, you need a quarter rest. You can, C-A-N can, you are able to write a half rest on strongest and strong beats. Always. Always. That's always cool. Let's break down one more incorrect example. Okay, so this is wrong. Well, number one, because we need our divide between beats 2 and 3. I don't know why that turned an arrow, but here we go, right? This cannot do that. That's a no. And that's really the only thing that's wrong here. Now, keep in mind that what we want here is we want 3 beats of silence, right? So beat 2, 3, and 4. These all have rests on it, right? Shh. We want rests on beats 2, 3, and 4. So we want one sound, we want one attack on beat 1, and then on 2, 3, and 4, shh, we want silence. So let's take a look at what that looks like when we write it correctly. And sure enough, because you cannot have that half rest on a weak beat, and you also don't want to break the divide between beats 2 and 3, only 3 things can do that: a whole rest, a whole note, and a half note. Very good. We have our half rest written on beat 2 because we want 3 beats of silence in a row. Remember, we have beats 2, 3, and 4. Shh. We want silent. Over here, beats 2, 3, 4 again. Yep. They all have rests on them. They're all silent. So these measures sound exactly the same. They're just written differently. So on our weak beat, we have our quarter rest. And starting on our strong beat, we have the half rest that lasts, very correctly, 2 beats. Now, it would not be correct to have a quarter rest here and a quarter rest here because rule number 3, whenever possible, we need to combine rests, and that gets us our half rest there. I will see you in the next lesson where we're going to do some breakdowns in 3/4. In this lesson, we're going to continue to break down the correct and incorrect uses of notes and specifically rests in measures. So just a quick reminder that whenever we see 4/4 common time, we're going to imagine there is a divide between beats 2 and 3. There's a divide right down the middle of the measure. So we can see here in our first incorrect example that that half rest would start on beat 2 and it would last into beat 3, right? Because it gets 2 beats. So it starts here and really it lasts all the way up to here, right? It's 2 beats of silence. Now that's crossing our imaginary line, which is a no. Cannot do that. So the correct way of writing that would be 2 quarter rests. That way we have, yay, the imaginary line between beats 2 and 3. So let's look at this incorrect example. This example is incorrect for 2 reasons, actually very similarly to the first example. This is incorrect because we have a rest starting on a weak beat going into a strong beat. Whenever we have a rest on a weak beat, we need to write a different rest on the next beat. It is also incorrect because that rest is crossing our imaginary divide between beats 2 and 3. That half rest right here lasts for 2 beats. It gets 2 counts. No. We don't want that. So the way we're actually going to show this, keep in mind right here, we're talking about 3 beats of rest. 3 beats of rest. So we want 3 counts all in a row on 2, 3, and 4 of silence. How are we going to show that? This is how we show it. Number 1, we have our imaginary divide between beats 2 and 3. Number 2, we have the rest that is starting on the weak beat, stays on the weak beat, and then we have a new rest starting on the next beat. Let's look at one more in 4/4. This is actually a correct example. So let's say a whole note starts here. Yep, it can last through, so technically crossing the divide because it's worth 4 counts. And a half note, sure enough, can start on beat 2 and last into beat 3 and cross the divide. That is A-OK to do. I will see you in the next lesson where we're going to break down some correct and incorrect examples in 3-4. In this lesson, we're going to be breaking down examples in 3-4 with incorrect and correct rests. Now, 3-4 is a little easier than 4-4 because we don't need to think about that imaginary divide, or maybe it's harder than 4-4 because we don't have that imaginary divide to rely on. Let's unpack some measures, shall we? Okay, so this is incorrect because it is breaking rest rule number 2. You cannot have a rest start on a weak beat and last into the next beat. No, cannot have that. So let's break down what we want to have happen here. What we want to have happen here is we want a sound on beat 1, right? We want a quarter note on beat 1, and then we want 2 beats of silence. We want beat 2 and 3 to be silent. How are we going to write that correctly? There you go, just like that. So whenever you have a weak or weakest beat that you want to be silent, you need that quarter rest. You need the quarter rest. Always, 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 always. We can go back, we can look at our colors, and sure enough, half rests, you see that? Half rests only go, they only go on green or yellow, they only go on strongest or strong. Only. No exceptions. Now let's talk about one more. In 3-4, we have a quarter rest on beat 1, and we have a quarter rest on beat 2, and then a quarter note on beat 3. So essentially what we want is 2 beats of shh, beat 1, beat 2. We want silent. Now the problem here is that this is breaking rest rule number 3, that all rests must be combined if they can. If you remember, we just talked about this, that the half rest can go on green or yellow. And so sure enough, what we need to do is we need to combine those 2 rests into a half rest that lasts for 2 beats. So look, it sounds exactly the same. 2 beats of silence here, 2 beats of silence here. We're just following the rules in the correct example. I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to give you some composition ideas for you to start writing different rhythmic compositions with for either 4 measures or, as you learned how to do a couple lessons ago, 8 measures at a time. So these are just 1 measure examples of different combinations of notes and rests. Here's 2 examples of 2 beats of rest in a row using half rests in 4-4. Here's 1 beat of rest and a half note. That's fun. Here's 1 beat of rest and a half note in 3-4. Here's 2 consecutive beats of rest and quarter notes, which is very interesting. So we can have a half rest, 2 quarter notes. We can have a quarter note, quarter rest, quarter rest. Why? Why can we not write a half rest there? Well, for 2 reasons. Number 1, we have our imaginary divide. And number 2, half rests cannot start on a weak beat. And in 4-4, beat 2 is, weak. And then finally, we can have a half rest starting on beat 3. 2 consecutive beats of rest and a quarter note in 3-4. This is always very interesting. Whenever you see 3-4, remember, you're always going to have these 2 quarter rests on the end because beat 2 is weak. So you cannot start a half rest there. It's always got to be 2 quarter rests, whereas at the beginning, our first beat is strongest, which means a half rest can start there. Here's 1 beat of rest. So basically just going to juggle around a quarter note. There you go. So that's 1 beat on beat 1, 1 beat of rest on beat 2, 1 beat of rest on beat 3, 1 beat of rest on beat 4, and then the same thing in 3-4. Now, these are not things for you to copy or follow. These just give you an idea of different combinations of notes and rests. There are so many more combinations out there than what we have right here. And I will see you in the next lesson. Oh, but it's not over yet. Click here to watch the next video lesson or up here for the full video playlist.